So if you were, anywhere near a shopping mall in the mid-90s, you probably remember those kiosks.
Oh, yeah, right in the middle of the walkways.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Just covered in these large framed posters.
Hmm.
And standing around them would be this group of people, completely silent, just staring blankly at what looked like basically a chaotic explosion of neon pixels.
The Magic posters, I mean, the technical term is an autostereogram, but yeah, the cultural phenomenon of the Magic.
Right.
It was honestly a fascinating psychological study just watching people interact with them.
It really was.
Yeah.
Because, like, half the people standing there would suddenly gasp and say, oh, wow, it's a sailboat, or look at the dolphin.
Yeah, they get it instantly.
And the other half, and I was definitely in this half, would just be squinting, moving our heads back and forth, getting increasingly frustrated.
Mhm.
Because to us, all it was two-dimensional visual noise. It just looked like a television tuned to a dead channel, but, in bright pink and teal.
And that frustration is actually the perfect entry point into what we were exploring today. Because when someone couldn't see the image, the immediate assumption was often that the other people were just making it up.
Right, like it's a prank.
Exactly. That they were using their imagination, like looking up at the clouds and deciding a puffy shape looks like a bunny rabbit. But the reality of a Magic Eye image is entirely different. It's not a subjective inkblot test.
No, there is actual data there. It's objectively encoded into the pattern.
Right. The creators of those images use complex algorithms to embed a fully three-dimensional image within that two-dimensional repeating pattern. The sailboat is genuinely objectively there.
But you can't just look at it normally.
No, to see it, you have to do something highly unnatural with your eyes. You have to decouple your focusing mechanism from your convergence mechanism. Normally, your eyes aim at the exact same spot they focus on, right? Like the surface of the paper.
Yeah, makes sense.
But to see the 3D image, you have to aim your eyes through the paper. You focus on a point in the distance while allowing your convergence to rest on the 2D plane.
So you have to fundamentally alter the way you look at the world right in front of you.
Exactly.
And this provides such a profound lens for the subject of our deep dive today. We're looking at the concept of faith. And our mission is to unpack this huge stack of sources we have: sermons, theological journals, Hebrew lexicons, pastoral articles.
There's a lot of material.
It is, yeah. But we want to get past that cliched dictionary definition, because in modern culture, we treat faith exactly like the person staring at the clouds. We think it's wishful thinking. We think it's pretending there's a bunny rabbit when it's literally just water vapor.
Which is a completely modern and, frankly, a very reduced definition of the concept. The ancient perspective, the biblical perspective running through the literature we are examining, treats faith much more like the autostereogram.
Like the Magic Eye.
Right. It posits that the universe, human existence, history, all of it is the 2D pattern. Science is incredibly proficient at explaining the mechanics of that 2D surface. It maps the neon pixels, so to speak.
Yeah, the mechanics of it.
But faith is the mechanism by which human beings decouple their vision from the immediate surface to perceive the encoded 3D reality beneath it all. It is the pattern recognition of a creator's architecture.
It's the added dimension. And what I want you listening to consider as we move through this deep dive is, well, how much of your life is spent staring in total frustration at the 2D surface?
Oh, that's a great question.
Like the bills, the physical ailments, the chaotic news cycle. It just looks like noise. But what if there is an entirely different, solid, three-dimensional reality waiting to be seen if the focus of your perception was just slightly shifted?
That shift in perception is crucial.
Hmm.
But it does introduce an immediate philosophical problem from the sources. Let's say you successfully shift your focus. You stare at the poster, your eyes decouple, the 3D sailboat pops out, and you say, I see it. I believe there is a sailboat hidden in this image.
Okay.
Does that intellectual realization actually change your life in any meaningful way?
Well, not at all. I mean, I just walk away from the mall kiosk and go buy a pretzel. My life is exactly the same. I just have a new piece of trivia in my head.
Exactly.
And this gets to a massive point of friction in the historical text.
Yeah.
The difference between belief and faith. Because we use those words completely interchangeably today.
We do.
If I say, I believe Alexander the Great conquered Persia, or I say, I have faith that Alexander the Great conquered Persia, people assume I'm saying the exact same thing.
In our modern vernacular, yeah. And to be fair to the history, ancient texts sometimes blurred these lines too. Like, if you read the original Greek of the Gospel of John, the verb for believe is used constantly to describe a total life-altering faith.
Oh,
But as language evolved, particularly in English, a hard division formed. Belief became purely cognitive. It became the intellectual assent to a set of facts.
Right. Like, I can believe Alexander the Great existed based on historical evidence. But I'm not relying on Alexander the Great to pay my mortgage this month. That belief requires zero commitment from me.
Right, there's no personal stakes.
Or, to bring it closer to home, I fully believe that eating kale is better for my cardiovascular system than eating a dozen glazed donuts.
Right.
I accept the medical data as absolute truth,
Sure.
but my behavior on a Saturday morning often entirely contradicts that belief.
That is the perfect illustration of belief devoid of faith. You possess cognitive assent, but you lack existential commitment. You haven't handed yourself over to the reality of the facts.
Yeah.
And this is where the texts we're reviewing present a brilliant and honestly quite challenging thought experiment to test this distinction. It's often referred to as the airplane test.
I am so glad we are getting into this, because this thought experiment completely rewired how I view my own anxieties. So imagine 3 people standing at the gate of a busy airport, getting ready to board a commercial flight.
Okay, set the scene.
Passenger A is a seasoned aeronautical engineer. She has spent 20 years studying fluid dynamics, lift, drag, thrust. And on top of that, she personally knows the captain of this specific flight and knows his impeccable safety record.
So she knows everything there is to know.
Exactly. When they call their boarding group, she casually strolls down the jet bridge, sits in her seat, and starts doing a crossword puzzle. Absolute serene confidence.
Her internal state is one of complete peace, grounded in exhaustive knowledge.
Right. Now, passenger B is your quintessential exhausted business traveler. He flies 80,000 miles a year. He doesn't know how a jet engine works, and frankly, he doesn't care. Air travel is just a bus ride in the sky to him.
He's just going through the motions.
Yeah. He boards the plane, immediately puts on his noise-canceling headphones, pulls his hat down, and falls asleep before they even close the cabin door. Total apathy.
So he possesses a generalized assumption of safety, but no active engagement.
Right. Then we have Passenger C. Passenger C is absolutely terrified of flying. He has read every news article about turbulence and engine failure. His sympathetic nervous system is in overdrive.
The white knuckle flyer.
Oh, completely. His amygdala is screaming at him that he is about to step into an aluminum tube of death. He is sweating. His heart rate is 140. He is physically shaking. Every instinct in his body is telling him to run back to the parking garage.
But he doesn't.
No. Fighting back a panic attack, he forces himself down the jet bridge. He sits in his seat, grips the armrests until his knuckles are white, and spends the entire flight silently bracing for impact.
Okay, so the philosophical question posed by this scenario from the sources is, of those 3 individuals, the supremely confident engineer, the apathetic businessman, and the terrified flyer who exercised the most faith in the airplane?
See, the intuitive answer, the way we normally use the word in society, is the engineer, or maybe the sleeping guy. Because we equate faith with a feeling of peace. We think if you have doubts, if you are terrified, then by definition you must lack faith.
But the rigorous theological definition flips that entirely on its head. The answer is that they all exercise the exact same amount of faith, down to the very last drop.
The exact same amount. Because despite the terror, the sweat, and the shaking, the terrified passenger still walked onto the plane.
Precisely. Faith is not defined by the absence of fear, nor is it defined by the presence of perfect, exhaustive knowledge. Faith is the literal, physical transfer of your trust and your physical safety onto the object in question.
The object being the plane.
Right. When that plane pushes back from the gate, all 3 of those passengers are in the exact same predicament. If the plane crashes, the confident engineer's deep knowledge of fluid dynamics does not save her. She goes down. And if the plane lands safely, the terrified passenger's panic does not cause him to crash. He arrives safely. Their internal psychological states are completely irrelevant to the objective reality of their faith. Their faith was demonstrated entirely by their action of boarding.
This completely unravels how we talk about belief. Because think about the people who stayed back in the airport terminal.
People who didn't board.
Right. There might be a guy sitting at the airport bar watching that plane push back, and he might 100% intellectually believe that the plane is going to arrive safely in Chicago. He has no doubts about it. But he exercised zero faith in that airplane. Why? Because he didn't get on it. He didn't commit his life to it.
And this brings us to one of the most jarring and provocative statements in ancient literature regarding this topic. It's a line from the letter of James in the New Testament.
What does James say?
Well, James is specifically addressing this exact gap between intellectual belief and committed faith. And he writes, "Even the demons believe and shudder."
It's such a haunting image. Demons possessing perfect theology.
It is logically devastating to the modern casual view of religion. A demonic entity within the biblical framework knows with absolute, unwavering certainty that God exists. They have witnessed the spiritual architecture of the universe.
Right, they don't have a crisis of evidence.
Exactly. Their intellectual belief is pristine. But they remain completely alienated because they possess zero trust, zero allegiance, and zero loving commitment. They are the ultimate example of the man sitting at the airport bar.
They believe the plane flies, but they refuse to get on.
Yes. They remain fiercely, violently opposed to getting on it. And the realization of that terrifying gap between what they know and their eternal alienation, that is what causes them to shudder.
That distinction is incredibly clarifying. But it also creates a massive practical problem for me. Let's say I realize I'm the guy at the bar, I'm staring at the 2D poster, I finally see the 3D reality, I see the airplane, but I am terrified.
Yeah, how do you take the step?
Right. How do I actually take this step? What is the human mechanism that moves us from the safety of the terminal onto the terrifying reality of the airplane?
To understand that, we have to look at how the ancient writers themselves conceptualize this process, specifically looking at the original Greek and Hebrew languages. And it's fascinating because they approach the mechanics of this from two totally different, almost opposing directions.
Yeah, because language is always a window into the psychology of a culture. Let's start with the Greek world. That was the language of the New Testament and the broader Hellenistic philosophy of the time. The primary word they use for faith is pistis.
Pistis, which comes from a very specific root word, right?
Yes, the verb pitho, which fundamentally means to persuade or to be won over.
But in the theological context, pistis is not about human persuasion. It's not about winning a debate using Socratic logic. It is defined as divine persuasion.
Just from the outside.
Exactly. The classical Greek lexicons describe it as a gift, an organ of perception that is granted to an individual from the outside.
Like receiving a sixth sense. You didn't grow it yourself, it was handed to you.
Right. It is the deep internal warranty that the invisible things are actually real. The scholar F.F. Bruce characterized this Greek concept of faith as the organ which enables people to see the invisible order. So in the Greek mindset, faith is very much treated as a noun. It is a capacity, a possession that is birthed in you.
Okay, but then you cross the cultural divide into the ancient Near East, into the Hebrew mindset, and the entire framework shifts. It stops being this ethereal, philosophical concept and gets very dirty and practical.
The Hebrew word is emuna.
Yes, imuna. And I was fascinated by the etymology here in the sources. Imuna shares a root with the word uman.
Which refers to an artisan or a craftsman, like a blacksmith, a carpenter, a stonemason.
Right, someone who works with their hands in the physical world. And even in modern Hebrew, the word immunum translates to exercises or going to the gym for a workout.
That's a huge shift from the Greek view.
It is. The Hebrew mindset doesn't treat faith as a noun you passively receive. It treats it as a verb. It is an active craft. It's muscle tissue. If a blacksmith stops swinging his hammer, he loses his calluses and his timing. If you stop doing your immunum, your muscles atrophy.
So it's a dynamic, fluid state of being.
Yeah. This is where I start to struggle with the texts. How can both of these things be true simultaneously?
It's a paradox.
Exactly. The Greek view says faith is a spontaneous divine organ transplanted into me by God. The Hebrew view says it's a relentless daily physical workout that I have to sweat and bleed for. Am I a passive recipient of a gift, or am I a craftsman grinding away at the forge?
It feels like these two ancient cultures are describing two totally different religions.
It does.
But synthesizing these two concepts actually provides the most robust psychological picture of how humans change. Think about the physical body. You did not manufacture your own muscles. Your muscular system, your genetic potential for strength, the very existence of your bicep, that was a gift of biology.
Right, I didn't invent my arms.
Exactly. It was granted to you entirely from the outside. That is the Greek pistis, the origin, the capacity, the spark of divine persuasion.
Okay, so the equipment is the gift.
Precisely. But simply possessing a bicep does not make you strong. To actualize that potential, to actually lift a heavy burden in the real world, you have to subject that muscle to the Hebrew emunah. You have to take the gift to the gym.
You have to actually use it.
Right. You have to tear the fibers through action, experience resistance, and practice the craft of strength. The Greek highlights the divine origin. The Hebrew highlights the human experience of lived reality.
Okay, that makes sense. You can't separate them.
Yeah.
You need the gym membership, but you still have to sweat.
Absolutely.
And this Hebrew emphasis on action brings up a really counterintuitive idea from the sources that I found deeply challenging. We live in an era heavily influenced by the Enlightenment. Our default operating system is, well, I need to understand something perfectly, review all the peer-reviewed data, and mitigate all risk before I take an action.
We want the intellectual guarantee before we commit the physical self.
Exactly. I need to know exactly how the jet engine works before I board the plane. But the Hebrew tradition flips this entirely backwards. There is a famous moment in the historical texts regarding the Israelites at Mount Sinai. When they are presented with the Torah, the covenant, their collective response is, "We will do and we will understand,"
We will do, and then we will understand. Action precedes comprehension.
which sounds completely reckless to the modern ear. It sounds like blind faith. But the argument is that certain types of knowledge are fundamentally inaccessible to the intellect alone. They can only be unlocked through the physical experience of doing.
There was an analogy in one of the pastoral articles that made this click perfectly.
The strawberry analogy.
Classic epistemological exercise.
Let's say you have never tasted a strawberry in your entire life. You don't even know what they are. I could sit down and write you a comprehensive 500-page scientific manual on the strawberry. I could break down the exact molecular structure of the fructose. I could describe the precise wavelength of red light it reflects. I could analyze the cellular structure of the seeds on the outside. And you could memorize that book. You could pass a doctoral exam on strawberry biology.
So I would possess perfect cognitive belief about the strawberry.
Yes. But until you actually pick up a strawberry, put it in your mouth and bite down on it, you still have absolutely no idea what a strawberry tastes like.
Right, you're missing the core experience.
Exactly. The experience provides a category of knowledge that the intellect is physically barred from accessing. The only way to truly understand it is to commit to the action of eating it. We will do, and then we will understand.
And there is a remarkable historical anecdote in the sources that illustrates the deep psychological resistance we have to this concept. It involves a prominent Jewish activist and philanthropist from the 20th century named Gordon Sachs.
Oh, right. He was a highly educated, deeply analytical man.
He was. And he found himself in a private audience with one of the most influential Jewish leaders of the century, the Lubavitcher Rebbe.
Two incredibly sharp minds going head to head.
Exactly. And Sachs, being a product of modern analytical thinking, confesses his philosophical roadblock to the Rebbe. He essentially says, I am a rational man. I look at the universe and I can deduce the existence of a creator. I believe in God. But I simply cannot bring myself to believe that this creator handed down a specific roadmap, a specific set of rules and rituals for human daily life. It doesn't make logical sense to me.
So he's stuck at the airport bar. He sees the plane, but he won't get on because he can't rationally justify the flight path.
The Rebbe's response is fascinating. He doesn't engage in a fierce theological debate. He doesn't try to out-logic Sachs. Instead, he diagnoses Sachs' psychological posture. He quotes a line from the novel Zorba the Greek.
Which is an amazing pivot for a deeply orthodox rabbi.
It really is. He quotes the passage where Zorba says, "A man's head is like a grocer. It keeps accounts. The head's a careful little shopkeeper. It never risks all it has, always keeps something in reserve. Wise men and grocers weigh everything. They can never cut the cord and be free."
A careful little shopkeeper. What an incredibly sharp indictment of the modern intellectual ego. We want to put every ounce of evidence on the scale and make sure it perfectly balances before we invest a single dollar of our own comfort.
And the Rebbe looks at Sachs and tells him, "Your problem, Mr. Sachs, is that you are trying to find God's map through your head. You have to experience before you can truly feel and then be free to learn."
He had to bite the strawberry.
Yes. He was telling Sachs that as long as he remained the careful grocer, demanding perfect intellectual satisfaction before he acted, he would never taste the strawberry. The only way to access the truth of the roadmap was to start walking on it, to practice the emunah.
Okay, but this brings us to what might be the heaviest, most complicated part of this entire deep dive. Because if the Rebbe is right, and I have to fire my inner grocer, cut the cord, and just blindly bite the strawberry, where do I get the power to do that?
Right, what's a power source?
Especially if I am the terrified passenger C on the jet bridge. I am shaking. My inner grocer is screaming at me that this is a bad investment. How do I actually generate the horsepower to take the step?
This question leads us directly into one of the most profound and often fiercely debated theological assertions in the historical texts. It addresses the fundamental engine of faith. Where does it actually come from?
Yeah, where does it?
Well, the texts, particularly a deep dive into a sermon by theologian John Piper alongside ancient lexicons, present a devastating diagnosis of the human condition. They argue that the reason you cannot simply generate the horsepower to believe is because, spiritually speaking, you are dead.
Dead. Not sick, not confused, not unmotivated. Dead.
Dead. The biblical framework, specifically in texts like the letter to the Ephesians, operates on the premise that human beings in their natural state are dead in trespasses and sins. A spiritually dead person cannot suddenly drum up a spiritual pulse any more than a corpse can suddenly decide to run a marathon.
Wait, I have to push back on this because human beings clearly possess willpower. People do incredibly brave, self-sacrificial, terrifying things every day without any religious motivation.
Sure they do.
A firefighter runs into a burning building, a soldier jumps on a grenade. Why can't I just use that same human willpower, that same grit, to muster up faith?
Because the texts argue that faith is not a subset of human courage. Human courage operates on the horizontal plane, the 2D reality. You can use willpower to overcome a physical fear, but faith is the vertical connection to the 3D reality of a holy God. And the theological premise is that humanity's fundamental alienation from God is so complete that the human will is entirely captive to its own desires. Therefore, if a person actually takes the step of faith, if they actually perceive the 3D reality and trust it, that action did not originate within them.
It had to come from outside.
Yes, it was entirely 100% a gift of divine grace.
For by grace you have been saved through faith.
Yeah.
And this is not your own doing. It is the gift of God. Ephesians 2:8. I've heard that verse 1,000 times, but when you frame it against the idea of spiritual death, it changes everything.
It really does.
But I still have to ask why? Why would the system be designed this way? Why wouldn't God just build us with the natural capacity to choose him? Why does it have to be an external gift?
The texts are incredibly explicit about the reason for this design: to eliminate boasting.
Boasting, human pride.
Exactly. Think about the psychology of human achievement. If faith was simply a matter of intellectual rigorousness or superior moral willpower, it would inevitably become a merit badge.
Oh, wow.
The confident engineer on the airplane would look back at the terrified passenger and say, "I am safer than you because I am smarter than you. I figured this out." The person who naturally possesses a bold, risk-taking personality would feel spiritually superior to the person who is naturally anxious.
It would just replicate the exact same hierarchies of power and ego that we have in the secular world. The strong win, the weak lose.
But if faith is entirely a gift, it levels the playing field completely. The texts make a vital economic distinction between a wage and a gift. If you work a 40-hour week at a factory, your employer hands you a paycheck. That is a wage. You earned it. You deserve it.
Right.
If your employer tried to claim they were giving you a beautiful gift out of the kindness of their heart, you would be deeply offended. You'd say, "No, I bled for this. You owe me."
You can demand a wage. You have legal standing to claim it.
But a gift, by its very definition, is unearned. It is entirely dependent on the unmerited favor of the giver. If salvation and faith were a wage, humanity could stand before the creator of the universe and demand their due. They could boast.
But they can't.
Right. Because it is a gift given to spiritually bankrupt people who could never earn it, all boasting is violently stripped away. The only appropriate response to a gift is profound, humbled gratitude.
I want to pause here because if you were listening to this and you are someone who struggles with chronic doubt or religious anxiety, this concept is the most liberating thing we are going to talk about today.
It's incredibly freeing.
I know so many people, myself included at times, who view faith as a strenuous mental exercise. We clench our jaws, we furrow our brows, and we try to force ourselves to believe. We treat doubt as a failure of our own willpower. We are trying to manufacture the gift ourselves.
It's an exhausting way to live. The psychological toll of constantly monitoring your own internal certainty is crushing.
There's a quote in the sources from Martin Lloyd-Jones. He was a prominent 20th century Welsh minister who actually started his career as a physician. So he understood human anatomy and psychology deeply.
A great perspective to have.
Yeah. And he wrote that true faith has an element of assurance and confidence without strain. He said, if there is strain or tension trying to persuade yourself to keep from doubting, you can be quite sure that it is not faith.
It is a brilliant psychological diagnostic. If you are straining, you are relying on the flesh. You are relying on the human will.
Which we established is dead.
Exactly. True faith, because it is a gift, allows for a fundamental relaxation of the soul. It is the terrified passenger on the plane finally exhaling, releasing the death grip on the armrests, and realizing that his straining is doing absolutely nothing to keep the plane in the air. The plane is holding him.
The heavy lifting is done by the engines, not the passenger. It is incredibly freeing, and you knew the but was coming.
The inevitable theological collision.
Yes. Because if we establish that the engine of faith is a pure, 100% free gift from God, requiring zero human effort or merit, we immediately crash headfirst into the other half of the biblical texts. We are entering what is arguably the most fiercely contested, blood-soaked theological debate in Western history.
Faith versus works.
Yeah.
It is the fault line that split the Christian church and reshaped the geopolitical landscape of Europe.
So let's lay out the contradiction, because on the surface, it looks like the editors of the Bible made a massive, glaring error. We have two prominent voices in the early church, Apostle Paul and James, who is historically recognized as the brother of Jesus.
Right.
And they both use the exact same historical figure, the ancient patriarch Abraham, to prove two entirely opposite points.
Let's look at the textual evidence. In his letter to the Romans, the Apostle Paul is constructing a massive legal argument about how human beings are justified, how they are declared righteous before a holy judge. And Paul writes explicitly that a person is justified by faith apart from works of the law. He points to the book of Genesis, noting that Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. And crucially, Paul points out that this happened long before Abraham was circumcised or given any moral commandments.
Paul is saying, look at the timeline. Abraham didn't do a single religious work. He just believed the promise. And the judge banged the gavel and declared him righteous. It is pure, unadulterated gift.
But then we turn to the letter of James. And James is watching people in the early church claim they have this free gift of faith while ignoring the poor and living corrupt lives.
So James is dealing with a different problem.
Yes. So James asks a rhetorical question. He says, "Was not Abraham our father justified by works when he offered up his son Isaac on the altar? You see that faith was active along with his works, and faith was completed by his work."
And then the hammer blow.
And then James delivers the hammer blow. A person is justified by works and not by faith alone.
Apart from works? Not by faith alone. I mean, I don't see how you can interpret that as anything other than a direct contradiction. How do theologians reconcile this without just picking their favorite guy and ignoring the other?
The reconciliation requires understanding the specific cultural and philosophical enemies that Paul and James were fighting. They were fighting on two entirely different fronts of the same war.
Okay, lay out the fronts.
Paul was fighting a disease called legalism. He was dealing with religious people who believed they could earn their way into God's favor by meticulously keeping the law, by getting circumcised, by observing dietary restrictions. They were trying to buy the plane ticket with their own moral currency.
They were trying to turn the gift into a wage.
Exactly. So Paul drops a nuclear bomb on that idea. He says no amount of pre-salvation works can ever justify you. You are spiritually dead. It must be a free gift.
And what about James?
James, however, is writing to a different audience later on. He is fighting a disease called antinomianism, from the Greek anti, meaning against, and nomos, meaning law.
So against the law.
Right. These were people who heard Paul's message of free grace and weaponized it. They said, great, if my works don't save me, then my actions don't matter. I can live however I want, indulge my every desire, ignore the suffering of others, and I still get the free ticket to heaven.
Which is a terrifyingly common human reaction to getting something for free.
It is the ultimate abuse of grace. So James steps in and attacks the nature of their so-called faith. He is talking about post-salvation works. He is arguing that if you claim to have received this cosmic, dead-raising gift of divine life, but your daily existence exhibits zero transformation, zero love, zero sacrifice, then the thing you are calling faith is actually a corpse.
It's the faith of demons.
Yes. True faith inevitably, organically produces good works, the way a healthy apple tree inevitably produces apples.
The sources from the Gospel Coalition provided a really helpful mathematical equation that clarified this tension for me. The false view of religion, the legalistic view, is faith plus works equals salvation. I believe a little bit, I try really hard to be a good person, and hopefully at the end, God grades on a curve and lets me in.
Right. Faith plus works equals salvation, the transactional mindset.
Right. But the biblical framework, reconciling Paul and James, is faith equals salvation plus works.
Faith equals, in parentheses, salvation plus works.
You receive the free gift of faith, which instantly results in salvation. And that reality is so fundamentally transformative that it guarantees a life of subsequent good works. The works are the exhaust pipe of the engine, not the fuel.
That's a great analogy.
But understanding this intellectually is one thing. Living it out historically was a totally different nightmare. The academic papers we reviewed show how this exact debate nearly tore Western civilization apart.
The historical stakes cannot be overstated. If we trace this through the centuries, we see the psychological burden of getting this equation wrong. In the early centuries, theologians like Augustine championed the necessity of divine grace. But as time went on, the concepts began to blur.
Things got complicated.
Very. By the Middle Ages, the dominant framework, highly influenced by Thomas Aquinas, was what we call the synergistic view.
Synergy, meaning working together.
Yes. In this medieval framework, justification was not a one-time legal declaration of not guilty. It was a lifelong process. God would infuse grace into a person primarily through the sacraments of the church, baptism, communion, penance.
But that grace wasn't a guarantee, right?
No, it was an enablement. The individual then had to cooperate with that grace by doing good works and maintaining moral purity to slowly become righteous.
Which sounds incredibly exhausting. If my ultimate standing before God depends on my daily cooperation, my daily performance, how do I ever know if I've done enough?
You don't. And that was the pervasive psychological terror of the Middle Ages. You have to remember the context. This was an era ravaged by the Black Death, where a third of Europe's population vanished.
Death was everywhere.
Omnipresent. The afterlife was an immediate, terrifying reality. The church taught the concept of purgatory, a place of agonizing purification for those who died with unconfessed sins or who hadn't fully cooperated with grace. Because no one could ever be certain they had done enough good works, the fear of purgatory was absolute.
And this fear created a market. It led to the transactional corruption of the church, the selling of indulgences. You're terrified your deceased mother is burning in purgatory. Give the church a gold coin and we'll transfer some of those surplus good works of the saints to her account.
It was the ultimate monetization of the faith plus works equation.
Which brings us to a German Augustinian monk in the 16th century named Martin Luther. Luther's the tragic embodiment of this medieval anxiety. He was absolutely desperate to be righteous before God. He would fast until he was emaciated.
He was torturing himself.
Literally. He would sleep on freezing stone floors without a blanket to punish his flesh. He would confess his sins to his superiors for up to 6 hours a day, obsessing over every stray, selfish thought.
He was the ultimate careful grocer, but his ledger was entirely in the red, and he knew it. He famously said he grew to hate the phrase, the righteousness of God, because he viewed it as a terrifying, impossible standard that a holy judge demanded of him, but that he could never meet.
He was crushed by this synergistic model. But then, while lecturing on Paul's letter to the Romans, Luther had a paradigm-shifting revelation. It's often called his Tower experience.
What did he realize?
As he studied the Greek text, he realized he had entirely misunderstood the phrase, the righteousness of God. He realized Paul was not describing a standard God demands. Paul was describing a gift God provides.
Ah, the forensic view of justification.
Yes. Forensic meaning a legal reality. Luther realized that justification is a courtroom declaration. It is God the judge bringing the gavel down and declaring the sinner righteous, not because the sinner has successfully cooperated and become morally pure, but because the perfect righteousness of Christ has been credited, imputed, to their account through faith alone, sola fide.
The relief that must have flooded his system.
He wrote that when he understood this, he felt as though he had been born again and had entered paradise itself through open gates. The strain of trying to earn the wage was over.
That's powerful.
Now, to maintain our impartiality here, the sources detail that the Catholic Church did not just roll over. They convened the Council of Trent to directly combat Luther's Protestant Reformation.
And at Trent, they explicitly doubled down on the synergistic view. They formalized the doctrine that justification requires human cooperation and the sacraments, and they issued anathemas, formal curses against anyone who taught justification by faith alone.
Why were they so opposed to it?
They believed Luther's doctrine of free grace would destroy morality and lead to absolute societal anarchy. They believed it was a license to sin.
Which brings us right back to James fighting the antinomians. It is the eternal pendulum swing of the human heart. And what is so striking to me is that even if you completely remove the religious context, we still fall into these exact same two traps today. Our culture is completely divided between secular moralism and secular antinomianism.
Oh, that's fascinating. Elaborate on the secular versions of these.
Well, secular moralism is the exhaustion of modern hustle culture and virtue signaling. We don't use theological terms, but we are absolutely terrified of being deemed unrighteous by the cultural courtroom. So we perform.
We curate our lives.
Yes. We curate perfect social media feeds to prove we are successful. We loudly adopt the correct political opinions to prove we are virtuous. We are exhausted, anxious grocers, constantly weighing our social capital, terrified of being canceled or deemed unworthy. We are trying to earn our justification through the works of the modern law.
And on the other extreme,
The secular antinomians. This is the nihilistic, hyper-individualistic side of culture that says, nothing matters. There is no objective truth, so just do whatever feels good. Live your truth. Don't let anyone judge your actions.
freedom without a compass.
Exactly, which inevitably spirals into addiction, isolation, and despair.
It's a profound observation. Both extremes rob the individual of true freedom. Moralism robs you of peace because you are eternally insecure. You never know if your resume is good enough. Antinomianism robs you of meaning and transformation, leaving you trapped in your own destructive impulses.
So they both failed.
The historical argument of these texts is that only the biblical concept of justification by faith alone, where you are entirely accepted and loved independent of your performance, which then generates a profound, grateful desire to change and love others, can provide both absolute peace and genuine moral transformation.
So we have spent a lot of time in the deep theological waters. We've talked about the mechanics, the Greek and Hebrew origins, and the massive historical wars over this concept. But I want to bring this down to the pavement.
The practical application.
Yeah. What does this lived-out, balanced, faith-producing works life actually look like?
Yeah.
If I am walking around with Amuna, what does my Tuesday look like? To answer this, the sources take us to a specific text that is often called the Hall of Heroes.
Hebrews chapter 11. It is essentially a curated museum of faith within the biblical canon. The author lists figures from ancient Jewish history who, fueled entirely by their trust in the unseen 3D reality, accomplished astonishing things.
But the article from Ligonier Ministries that analyzed this chapter made an observation that I found incredibly comforting. Because when we hear Hall of Heroes, we think of Marvel superheroes. We think of people with jaw-dropping moral purity and fearless personalities.
But like they weren't.
No. The text reveals that these were incredibly flawed, deeply compromised individuals.
They were, in many respects, worldly nobodies.
Right. I mean, you look at the founder of the faith, Abraham.
Right.
He is lauded for leaving his comfortable home and stepping out into the terrifying unknown because God told him to. Amazing faith. But this is the same Abraham who, when he got scared of a foreign king, lied and said his wife was just his sister, effectively handing her over to a pagan harem to save his own skin. He was a coward.
If not exactly heroic.
Or look at Noah. He spent decades building a massive, landlocked ship because he believed a flood was coming. The amount of public ridicule and mockery he must have endured is unfathomable. Yet later, we see him completely humiliated in a drunken stupor.
The biblical text is relentlessly honest about the flaws of its heroes. And this is not an accident. It is a theological necessity.
Why is that?
If these individuals possessed pristine moral character, the reader would naturally conclude that their power came from their own internal greatness. But by showcasing their profound weaknesses, the text reinforces the core principle we discussed earlier. The power of faith does not reside in the person believing.
Where does it reside?
The power of faith resides entirely in the object of that faith.
The Ligonier text made a really sharp point about this that acts as a warning for modern listeners. We have this pervasive cultural idea, often propagated by the name it and claim it prosperity teachers, that faith is a creative force, that your belief is a magic wand.
Right, if you just visualize it.
Yeah, if you just visualize the promotion, if you just believe hard enough that the cancer is gone, your faith will create that reality.
It reduces faith to a psychic superpower.
Exactly. But the historical Orthodox view completely rejects this. Faith does not create reality. Faith simply receives what God has already decreed. My belief didn't create the airplane, the engineers did.
Your faith just got you on board.
Right. My faith is simply the mode by which I step onto it. The intensity of my faith doesn't matter. The structural integrity of the object I am trusting is what saves me.
And because the object of the faith is an omnipotent creator, faith acts as a profound, impenetrable defense mechanism for the fragile human mind. This transitions us to a vivid military metaphor found in Paul's letter to the Ephesians, chapter 6.
The shield of faith.
Oh,
I have to admit, growing up, whenever I heard shield of faith, my brain immediately pictured Captain America.
oh,
A
totally.
little circular buckler shield strapped to the forearm. You know, you duck and weave and try to bat away arrows like a ninja. It felt very individualistic and very stressful.
The visual is common, but historically inaccurate to the text. When Paul wrote the letter to the Ephesians, He was literally chained to a Roman legionnaire. He was staring at the pinnacle of first-century military technology. The shield he was referencing was the Roman scutum.
The scutum. This completely changed the metaphor for me. This was not a little buckler. The scutum was a massive, semi-cylindrical shield, often 4 feet tall and 2.5 feet wide.
It was huge.
It was essentially the size of a door.
Hmm.
It was designed to cover the entire body of the soldier from the chin down to the shins.
And the engineering of the scutum is highly relevant to Paul's metaphor. It was made of multiple layers of thin wood, glued together so the grain alternated, much like modern plywood, making it incredibly resilient to shattering. But the most important feature was the outer layer.
The leather. The front of the wooden shield was covered in canvas and calfskin or leather, and before going into a major battle, the Roman soldiers would take their shields and completely submerge them in water.
They'd soak the leather until it was heavy and waterlogged.
Why? Because the ancient armies, particularly the Parthians, utilized a devastating psychological and physical weapon, the flaming arrow.
They would wrap the tips of their arrows in tow, soak them in highly flammable pitch or sulfur, ignite them, and fire them in massive volleys into the air.
The terror of seeing a sky full of fire raining down on you. If those arrows hit a dry wooden shield, the shield would catch fire, forcing the soldier to drop his only defense.
Which leaves them completely exposed.
But when the flaming pitch hit the waterlogged leather of the scutum, the wet leather would extinguish the flame on impact.
And Paul explicitly utilizes this imagery. He writes, "In all circumstances, take up the shield of faith, with which you can extinguish all the flaming darts of the evil one."
Extinguish the flaming darts.
Hmm.
The text identifies these arrows not as literal weapons, but as spiritual and psychological attacks. Doubts, temptations, accusations, and despair.
The internal battles.
Right. When your inner grocer is screaming at you at 2 a.m. saying, "Did God really forgive you? Look at your past. Look at what a failure you are. God doesn't love you." Those are the flaming arrows.
The accusation is the pitch and sulfur.
Yes. And if you try to fight off those accusations with your own intellect, or worse, if you try to pull out your own resume of good works and say, "No, look, I'm a good person, I volunteer," that is a dry wooden shield.
It won't hold up.
The flaming arrow of your own guilt will incinerate that defense because you know your own hypocrisy. You will catch fire. But when you hide completely behind the door-sized shield of the scutum, when your defense is entirely, "I am a failure, but Christ's perfect works have been imputed to me," the arrow hits the wet leather of grace and is immediately extinguished.
It is a posture of absolute shelter. But there is one more detail about the scutum that is crucial. It was rarely used in isolation. The Roman army conquered the known world not through individual heroics, but through disciplined corporate formations.
Right, they work together.
Specifically, the testudo, or tortoise formation.
The tortoise.
Mm.
The soldiers would pack tightly together. The men in the front would interlock their shields to form a solid wall. The men behind them would raise their shields over their heads, interlocking them to form a literal roof.
They became a walking armored tank.
No single soldier had to face the volley of arrows alone.
Which beautifully illustrates the communal nature of the Hebrew emunah. Faith is not meant to be an isolated individualistic struggle. When one person's faith is weak, when their arms are tired, the shield of the person next to them provides the roof.
And this isn't just ancient Roman history or ancient Hebrew patriarchs. The sources we reviewed from the Orchard Church grounded this theology in the modern world. They provided testimonies of normal people living this out today, people who are forming the testudo in their communities.
Yes, practical, contemporary examples of stepping onto the airplane.
We have the story of Annette Werley. She was a normal professional who felt a deep, terrifying burden to bring her faith into the corporate marketplace, a place that is often highly hostile to those ideas.
That's a huge risk.
It would have been much safer for her inner grocer to just keep her head down and collect her paycheck. But she stepped out in faith, decoupled her vision, and started a marketplace ministry for business leaders.
That takes emunah.
We have Steve Bond, a father who realized his son was about to leave for college. Instead of outsourcing his son's spiritual formation to a youth group and hoping for the best, he took the terrifying risk of stepping up, risking awkwardness and rejection to actively equip his son with the shield of faith.
These aren't stories of people parting the Red Sea. They are stories of people conquering the mundane, daily fears of modern life.
Like Mark Wilson, a business owner who admitted he had always kept his faith completely private, compartmentalized from his work. He was terrified of what his employees would think. But he finally took the step to stand up in front of 50 of his employees and boldly share the reality of what God had done in his life.
It's stepping into the unknown.
These are modern variations of Daniel in the lion's den. When you step into the den, you don't know if the lions are going to eat you or not. The flaming arrows are flying. But the shield holds.
Because the shield is anchored in a reality that supersedes the immediate danger.
Okay, let's take a deep breath. We have covered an immense amount of ground today. We started at the mall kiosk, frustrated by the chaotic 2D visual noise of our daily lives, realizing that faith is the mechanism that adjusts our focus to see the brilliant 3D reality encoded beneath it all.
We moved past the shallow, modern idea of cognitive belief, learning through the airplane test that true faith requires the physical commitment of the self, regardless of the fear we feel on the jet bridge.
We explored the beautiful paradox of the ancient languages, that faith is simultaneously a spontaneous divine gift, the Greek pistis, and a grueling daily artisan's craft, the Hebrew imana, a gym membership that we have to wake up and utilize.
We waded through the bloody historical battles of the Reformation, diagnosing our own tendencies toward anxious moralism and reckless antinomianism, and found psychological rest in the reality that the engine of faith is pure, unmerited grace.
And we visualized the courage of the ancient and modern heroes who took up the massive, waterlogged Roman shield to extinguish the flaming arrows of doubt and shame. But as we bring this deep dive to a close, there was one final, profound theological twist found in the sources. A thought that completely reframes everything we've discussed about the Great Debate.
The debate of faith versus works. We spent so much time establishing that we are saved by faith alone, apart from our own flawed attempts at righteousness. But the Gospel Coalition article points to a breathtaking theological irony. Ultimately, the biblical framework does not teach that we are saved by faith.
Wait.
At the very core of the cosmos, God's perfect justice cannot just wave away sin. Perfect justice requires perfect obedience. It requires works. The profound, paradigm-shattering truth of the Christian text is that we are saved by works.
You're saved by works?
They are Christ's works.
Wow.
It was his perfectly sinless life, lived in the mud and dust of the first century. It was his agonizing, sacrificial death on a Roman cross, and it was his victorious, death-shattering resurrection. Those were the grueling, flawless works required by justice.
And so, how does that become ours?
The miracle of the gift, the forensic imputation Luther discovered, is that when a spiritually dead person is given the gift to simply believe, the Holy Spirit takes Christ's flawless resume of works and permanently credits them to that person's account. His works become our works. The wage he earned is given to us as a gift.
The heavy lifting is already done. The ticket has been purchased. The plane is fully fueled, mechanically perfect, and sitting at the gate.
It's waiting for you.
And so, speaking directly to you, listening to this right now, if the heavy lifting is done, if the pressure to manufacture your own righteousness has been completely removed, what flaming arrows do you need to stop fighting on your own today and let the shield extinguish?
That's the question to sit with.
What is the terrifying step onto the airplane that your inner grocers is desperately trying to talk you out of? Because you do not have to spend the rest of your life sitting in the terminal, staring in frustration at a two-dimensional world. There's a massive, beautiful, three-dimensional reality waiting for you if you are simply willing to shift your focus.